what, 20 weeks ago when we began this overview. I remember bringing in several books. The first one that comes to mind is Praying the Scriptures for a Difference by Tim Gray, which goes through the practice of Lectio Divina. That's probably the best way to grow in the grace and knowledge of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ from our spiritual tradition that I know of. So that is what we're here for. Now, we spent all last week, if you remember, reviewing what we did prior to our New Year's break, where we went over all that we learned, all the first chapters of Genesis, and even before that, where we got the Bible and all of that, very briefly. And we ended last week with the beginning of the study of Noah. But I thought, I know there are questions about the chapters 4 and 5 that I just simply didn't get to during that time, either before the break or after. So I thought I would bring some of those up. So before we start our study of Noah in chapter 6 through 9 of Genesis, and yes, I see people already getting out their commentary, so if you have this, bring it up so that you can follow along. And I did want to, yes. In fact, if you do have the commentary, I am going to refer to it on page 25. So you might want to get that ready. So one of these questions, some leftovers about Genesis 3 through 5 that might be lingering is, whatever happened to the Garden of Eden? And did it even really exist? Okay, so that's one of the questions that I didn't really address before we go. And the simple answer to that is, it could have. Well, that's not much of an answer. What do you mean it could have? Well, remember, these chapters in Genesis, the first 11 chapters of Genesis, are not necessarily to be taken literally. They do refer to real historic events, but are put in a poetic manner so that the truths that they are telling are timeless. Okay? The Garden of Eden, it's very possible the Garden of Eden was a metaphor for our original place and relationship with God and not an actual location. Okay? On the other hand, it could have been. Could have been. Could have been. And if so, where was it? Well, you have to understand that the flood that came after the Garden of Eden completely transformed the surface of the earth. So any trace of where the Garden of Eden would have been is gone. So if it was an actual place, we have no way of locating it. Now I know some people will say, but yes, the Bible does mention 4 rivers that the Garden of Eden went through, and 2 of them are in Iraq, the Tigris and the Euphrates. So wasn't the Garden of Eden in Iraq? And it's like, well, that could have been a place that Moses told the people was the center of where everyone sprang from. And so they picked the location of where the center was that they all sprang from. Why would they pick Babylon? Why not pick Israel? Well, because when we get to the Tower of Babel, which happens after the flood, that's where everything is centered. And so everyone disperses from that. So it made sense to just kind of keep everyone geographically located. The Tower of Babel, the Garden of Eden, they were all in the same location. And in around the time of Nebuchadnezzar, which is around 500 BC, after the exile, one of the great wonders of the ancient world were in Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar's Hanging Gardens, which would have reminded the Jews that were there of the Garden of Eden and the Tower of Babel together in one place, historically speaking. And modern scholars, modern critics, I should say, of the Bible, point to the exile as the time when the books of the Bible, known as Genesis, were written, and said that this ancient wonder was the inspiration for the stories of the Garden of Eden and the Tower of Babel, to begin with. So it's like, they weren't even a part of Jewish mythology until the exile and they saw it for themselves. Now, I think that that's nonsense. I think it's actually the other way around, personally. But that's what some modern scholars look to. They look at the Hanging Gardens of Babylon as the inspiration for the stories of both the Garden of Eden and the Tower of Babel. I don't think that there's much validity to that, personally. Like I said, I believe it's the other way around. I think what Nebuchadnezzar was doing was not only impressing his latest queen, who missed the mountains that she came from, so he created a man-made mountain for her to feel at home in, but I think it also is reminiscent of the antediluvian time of both the Garden of Eden and the Tower of Babel. And he was replicating that in his day and age. That's my interpretation of it. So anyway. So that's one question. And then the big question. Do you believe, or did the patriarchs actually live to be 600, 700, or 900 years old? And for this, I would refer you to your commentary, page 25. Because if you look at chapter 5, at the descendants to Noah, you see that people lived hundreds and hundreds of years. Does anyone happen to know offhand who is the oldest person recorded in the Bible? I'm sorry? I thought I heard you. Who is the oldest recorded person in the Bible? Methuselah, yes. Do you know how long he lived? 969 years. He lived to be 969, and then he died. So if you look at verse 25 of chapter 5 of Genesis, it says, when Methuselah had lived 187 years, he became the father of Lamech. Methuselah lived after the birth of Lamech 782 years, and 25 and 26. He lived another 782 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus, all the days of Methuselah were 969 years, and then he died. So, the question is, well, you can't honestly believe that people live this long. There's obviously an error in the Bible, or this is just made up, or I don't know what else to think, but this is nonsense. Okay, that's the initial reaction of modern critics. So how do we answer this? Well, again, maybe. You didn't live back then, you don't know. Just because people don't live that long now didn't mean that they couldn't back then. We really can't say. Okay? Things were different. However, if you want a more detailed explanation, I would look on page 25 of your commentary under 930 years. Adam's age falls within the range of 777 to 969 years that characterizes the era before the flood. Blah, 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 blah. This is their explanation or possible alternate ideas as to why there are these extraordinary ages to the patriarchs. Okay? And they range from, some take the ages at face value and maintain the literal truth. That's one. Two, others have proposed that converting the years into months. But this makes for a problem. Some have said you take the age of the patriarchs and divide them by 10. Well, if you do that, then Enoch was the father of Methuselah when he was 6.5 years old. Don't think so either. Okay? So again, there's different ideas. Number 3, still others take the names of the patriarchs referred to clans. This was the clan of Methuselah that lasted 600 years, like a dynasty, you know, a dynastic name, like the Tudors, you know, in England or something. That's what this means. Maybe. Okay. And 4, probably the best hypothesis, and one that would help explain both the biblical and Near Eastern data, is that given primeval figures' extremely long lives was a way of conceptualizing the great antiquity of mankind. In other words, this may simply be a literary technique used to assert the remarkable age of the human race. I think that's probably the most balanced in between explanation for it, from either being too literal or too metaphoric. Is to say that, again, you don't have to take these literally, for one. Let's start there. These could perhaps be clans or dynasties or things like that, but or it could just simply be a literary device to say that humans have been on the earth a long, long time. A long, long time. Okay? Okay? So there you are. So those are the theories as to explain the long, ancient people living 700, 800, 900 years old in the past. So there you are.
Don't they question whether years were measured in measures of 12 months? Like the amount of months within a year is different?
I don't think so. Because then we have to assert then what is meant by years and days afterwards. I think there are some things that are consistent throughout the scriptures, and so when they mean years as we understand them. Just like in the creation story, a day is a day, day and evening, morning and evening came one day. Well, that's how long a day is in our understanding. It's not like it's thousands of years is a day. Okay? And you see what I mean? When it says a day, we mean a day like we understand it. Otherwise, everything starts to become too esoteric. It becomes too incomprehensible. So there are some things that are stated as days. And again, for example, in the day creation story, when you go to Exodus, and it says, just as God worked for 6 days and you rest, you work for 6 days and you rest. So if he meant 1,000 years, then you should work 1,000 years like God did, and then you can rest. No, see, that doesn't make sense. So he's making a connection between what the creation account is with what the Sabbath rest is in Exodus. So that means that our understanding of a day is a day. Now that doesn't mean that God literally did it in 6 days, and we've been down there before. But the point is, the way that the story of creation comes to us, it is analogous to our work week. So that means when it says they lived 900 years, then we have to understand that that meant 900 years. But what did that mean? What is it trying to tell us? And I would say, like I said, the most balanced opinion is the last one in our commentary, that says that this is probably a literary device to just say that human beings have been on the planet a long, long time. Okay? That's what that would be a balanced opinion of it. Okay? All right. Now, when we last left our story, Adam and Eve had their first 2 sons and other children. And the 2 sons that were highlighted were Cain and Abel. What happened to them? Cain killed Abel. And then Cain was separated from the Lot. And then Adam and Eve had another son, Seth. And it says in chapter 5 of Genesis, if you want to go back there to the very beginning of chapter 5, this is the book of the generations of Adam. When God created man, he made him in the likeness, blessed them, and named him man. They were created. When Adam lived, chapter 4. Adam lay with his wife, and she conceived and bore him Cain. Wait a minute, I was right. It was in chapter 5.
Yeah.
He had other sons and daughters, it says. Where is it? There it is, chapter 5, verse 4. The days of Adam after he became the father of Seth were 800 years. He had other sons and daughters. And all the days of Adam were 930, and then he died. So it shows the generations that came after the highlighted sons of Cain, Abel, and Seth. Okay? This doesn't mean there weren't any other people from Adam and Eve. It just means that these are the ones that have come down to us. And the rest of chapter 5 just shows all of the generations from Adam to Noah. It just takes a beeline through the line of Seth all the way to Noah. Every one of those men's names that are listed in chapter 5 start with Adam, goes through Seth, and ends up with Noah. That's where we end in chapter 5, verse 31. After Noah was 500 years old, Noah became the father of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So those are the, now does that mean there was no one else on the earth? No. There were all the descendants of Cain. Remember that he was sent away and he had sons and daughters, and they generated, and on and on and on and on. So the world was being populated in this antediluvian world. Antediluvian is just a big fancy word that means before the flood. That's all it means. Ante means before. Diluvian means deluge. Deluge is the flood. So the word antediluvian just simply means before the flood. Okay? Everyone good? Okay. So before the flood, it's just describing all of the populations of the world that are created. The flood is then, the story of Noah really begins in chapter 6 with what happened on the earth after Cain killed Abel, and Cain went his way, and Seth went his way. So as I mentioned last week, you get this story of two lines of people being developed. The godly or holier line, the faithful line of Seth, okay, the good son, if you will, of Adam and Eve, and the fallen away, not so good son, Cain, and